Gary Richard Whitton, sits on Florida's death row after a jury convicted him of murder based partly on testimony from a jailhouse informant. But that informant lied to the jury, and prosecutors knew it. Now the Supreme Court has stepped in to clarify when a trial includes false testimony, how courts figure out if that lie actually changed the outcome. The answer matters not just for Whitton, but for how courts handle convictions across the country. Nine Robes uses non-partisan, everyday language to focus on the facts of what the Supreme Court is saying. Here, you'll find clear, concise summaries of every Supreme Court opinion, stripped of legalese and clickbait headlines. Each post breaks down the facts, explains the court's reasoning, and highlights the crucial details that often go unnoticed. It's not just about what the court decided. It's about why those decisions matter. To give you a deeper understanding of the cases that define our nation's legal landscape. These summaries are generated by AI. Be careful and consult reputable sources when in doubt. Whitton was convicted of stabbing someone to death. The prosecution's key witness was Jake Ozio, a fellow inmate, who claimed Whitton had confessed to him in jail. Ozio also told the jury he had no criminal history. That was false. Prosecutors had Ozio's juvenile records showing he had been charged with assault, terroristic threats, and burglary. They never corrected his lie. After losing appeals in state court, Whitton asked a federal court to overturn his conviction, arguing that the prosecution's use of false testimony violated his right to a fair trial. Two lower courts said no. The Supreme Court disagreed, but not in the way Whitton hoped. The justices didn't say the lower courts reached the wrong answer. They said the lower courts used the wrong method to get there. The dispute centered on a technical but important question. When deciding whether a lie at trial actually affected a jury's verdict, what evidence should a court consider? Whitton's lawyers argued the lower court made a critical error. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals had relied on DNA test results from 2002 showing the victim's blood was on Whitton's boots. But that DNA evidence didn't exist when the trial happened. The jury never saw it. Using evidence the jury never heard to decide whether the false testimony mattered seemed backwards to Whitton's team. The state countered with two arguments. First, it said Whitton hadn't properly raised this specific claim in state court before going to federal court. Second, it argued the evidence of guilt was so overwhelming that the false testimony couldn't have changed anything anyway. The Supreme Court kept its ruling narrow and focused on procedure. The justices held that the lower court made a mistake by using post-trial DNA evidence when deciding whether the false testimony mattered. The logic is simple. Evidence that didn't exist at trial and wasn't presented to the jury couldn't have influenced the jury's decision. The court drew a sharp line between two different questions. One question is whether an error at trial affected the jury that actually decided the case. The other question is whether the defendant is actually guilty. These are not the same thing. A court deciding whether a trial error mattered must focus only on what the jury heard and saw, not on evidence discovered later. The Supreme Court sent the case back to the lower court to redo the analysis the right way. Justice Thomas, joined by Justice Alito, disagreed. Thomas argued the DNA reference was just one or two sentences in a 64-page opinion, and the rest of the analysis stood on its own. He also contended that Whitton should have lost the case entirely because he didn't properly raise this claim in state court first. Thomas added a separate criticism that Alito didn't join. He complained the Supreme Court was choosing to hear this case while ignoring other cases he considered more important, including cases about race-based school admissions and free speech on college campuses. This part of his dissent read more like a complaint about the court's priorities than a legal argument about Whitton's case. The Supreme Court's decision establishes an important principle for how courts should handle claims of false testimony at trial. When a defendant argues that a lie affected the jury's verdict, courts must ask one specific question. Did the jury hear this false evidence, and could it have changed their decision? Post-trial evidence, no matter how convincing, cannot answer that question. This is a high bar for defendants to clear. They must prove the testimony was false, that prosecutors knew it was false, and that there's a reasonable chance it affected the verdict. Federal courts reviewing state convictions apply an even stricter standard, but the Supreme Court's ruling ensures courts ask the right question in the right way. What happens to Whitton now remains uncertain. The lower court must reconsider his case using only the evidence the jury actually heard. Whether he ultimately wins may depend on a separate legal question about whether he properly exhausted his state court options. But the principle the Supreme Court established will guide courts in future cases for years to come. When deciding if a trial error mattered, focus on what the jury knew, not what we know now. Find us online at 9robes.ai. That's the number, 9robes.ai. Like and share this podcast with friends that like to be informed. 9 Robes provides AI summaries of U.S. Supreme Court cases. AI makes mistakes. People make mistakes too. We genuinely do our best to provide you with the most accurate summaries, but our best sometimes includes errors.